She drained my emergency medical fund for a luxury cruise to the Bahamas while I was fighting for my life in intensive care. I'm Amelia Hayes, and if you think family would never steal from you during your darkest hour, you're about to learn otherwise. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Massive car accident, 3 surgeries needed, insurance wouldn't cover experimental treatment that could save my mobility. My sister Coraline promised she'd handle accessing my medical savings account while I lay unconscious with machines keeping me alive. What she actually did was book herself and her boyfriend a 2-week Caribbean getaway, using every penny I'd saved for 5 years. I woke up to find my account emptied, and a hospital bill for $847,000 sitting on my bedside table. She thought I'd be too weak to fight back. She was wrong. What happened next didn't just destroy her vacation paradise, it rebuilt my entire world from the ground up and cost her everything she thought she owned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent hospital lights were drilling holes in my skull when I finally opened my eyes after 3 days in a medically induced coma. My entire left side felt like it had been rebuilt with spare parts, which wasn't far from the truth. The accident had shattered my femur, collapsed my lung, and left me with internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. But none of that pain compared to what I discovered when I reached for my phone with shaking fingers. 17 missed calls from Mercy General's billing department. 4 urgent voicemails about payment arrangements, and 1 text message from my sister Coraline that made my heart rate monitor start beeping frantically. "Hey sis, had to use your emergency fund for something urgent. We'll explain later. Focus on getting better XOXO." I stared at that message for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My emergency medical fund, the account I'd been building for 7 years, working double shifts as a cardiac technician at North Point Medical Center. The $127,000 I'd saved specifically for situations exactly like this one. With trembling hands, I opened my banking app. The password took me 3 tries because my fingers wouldn't stop shaking. When the screen loaded, the number staring back at me made me forget how to breathe. Account balance $23.47. I must have made some kind of sound because suddenly there were nurses around my bed, checking monitors, asking if I was in pain. Physical pain? No, this was something else entirely. This was the kind of betrayal that rewrites your DNA. The billing coordinator arrived 20 minutes later. Patricia Chen, according to her badge, with kind eyes and the practiced sympathy of someone who delivers devastating news for a living. She carried a manila folder thick enough to be a phone book. "Miss Hayes, I know this is difficult timing, but we need to discuss your treatment costs." She sat down in the chair beside my bed, the same chair where Coraline had been sitting just yesterday, holding my hand and telling me everything would be okay. Patricia opened the folder, and I saw numbers that didn't make sense. Surgery costs, ICU charges, medication expenses, physical therapy projections. The total at the bottom was written in red, $847,289. Your insurance covered the emergency stabilization, but they've denied coverage for the experimental spinal procedure you needed. They're calling it investigational. Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. Without that procedure, there's a significant chance you won't regain full mobility in your left leg. I nodded numbly, staring at the papers. The experimental procedure, the one my neurosurgeon, Dr. Alec Venros, had explained was my best shot at avoiding permanent disability. The one that cost $400,000 out of pocket. I had savings, I whispered. I had a medical emergency fund, specifically for this. Patricia consulted her notes. Yes, we received authorization from your emergency contact, Coraline Hayes, to access those funds. Unfortunately, the account showed insufficient funds when we processed the payment. The words hit me like another car accident. Emergency contact. I'd given Coraline access to my medical decisions and financial accounts years ago, back when we actually trusted each other. Back when I thought family meant something. What do you mean insufficient funds? My voice was barely audible. The account contained $23.47 when we attempted to process the initial payment of $50,000 for the spinal procedure deposit. I closed my eyes, fighting against the medication-induced fog in my brain. 7 years of 60-hour work weeks. 7 years of skipping vacations, driving a 10-year-old Honda, living in a studio apartment in Millbrook Heights, while my coworkers bought houses and new cars. 7 years of discipline and sacrifice, Also, I'd never be in this exact situation. Miss Hayes, I need to be direct with you. Without payment arrangements for the remaining procedures, we'll have to transfer you to County General for basic care only. That means no experimental treatment, standard physical therapy, and a very different prognosis for your recovery. County General, I'd worked there during my training. Understaffed, underfunded, and absolutely no place for someone with my injuries. It was where people went to survive, not to recover. After Patricia left, I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, each one a reminder of how powerless I'd become. The pain medication made everything feel distant and surreal, but one thought kept cutting through the haze with crystal clarity: where was my money? I managed to stay conscious long enough to call Coraline. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her cheerful voice echoed through the tiny speaker. "You've reached Coraline. I'm probably off having an adventure somewhere fabulous. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you when I'm back to reality." Having an adventure somewhere fabulous. The words felt like acid in my throat. I tried calling our parents next. Mom answered on the second ring, her voice thick with worry. "Amelia, honey, how are you feeling? Coraline said you were awake but still groggy from the anesthesia." "Mom, where is Coraline?" I asked directly. There was a pause. "She didn't tell you. She left yesterday for that cruise she'd been planning. She said she needed to clear her head after the stress of your accident." Cruise, the word detonated in my brain, like a small bomb. "What cruise, Mom?" "The one to the Caribbean, Bahamas, Jamaica, those places. She said she'd been saving up for it for months, and the timing was terrible with your accident, but she couldn't get a refund." Mom's voice carried that familiar tone of making excuses for Coraline's behavior. "She was so upset about leaving while you were hurt, but you know how she gets when she's stressed." I knew exactly how she got when she was stressed. She spent money, other people's money. "Mom, did she mention anything about accessing my emergency fund?" Another pause, longer this time. "She said something about handling your medical payments while you recovered. She has your power of attorney for medical decisions, doesn't she?" Power of attorney for medical decisions. Not financial decisions. But Coraline had always been creative with boundaries. After I hung up, I forced myself to stay awake despite the medication. I needed to understand exactly what had happened. Using the hospital's patient portal, I slowly pieced together the timeline of my sister's betrayal. The accident happened on Monday at 11:33 p.m. I was driving home from a late shift when a drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned my Honda at 60 miles per hour. Emergency surgery began at 1:15 a.m. Tuesday afternoon, while I was unconscious, Coraline had presented herself to the hospital's financial office as my emergency contact with authority to access my accounts. She'd provided my banking information and authorized a $50,000 payment for the spinal procedure deposit. But that payment never went through. Because by Tuesday evening, my account had been emptied. The bank records told the rest of the story. Tuesday at 2:47 p.m. Wire transfer of $127,000 to Sunset Caribbean Cruise Lines. Tuesday at 2:52 p.m., additional charge of $8,400 to the same cruise line for premium excursion package. My sister had literally stolen my medical fund while I was fighting for my life, then used it to book herself a luxury vacation. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the calculated nature of it. She'd waited until I was unconscious. She'd lied to the hospital about making payments. She'd left town immediately afterward, knowing I'd eventually wake up and discover what she'd done. As I lay there in that hospital bed, machines beeping around me and my future mobility hanging in the balance, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. The Amelia who had trusted her sister with her medical decisions was gone. The Amelia who had worked herself to exhaustion building a safety net that someone else could steal was gone. What remained was someone harder. Someone who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant making sure this never happened again. I reached for my phone with steady hands and began making a list. Not of what I'd lost, but of what I was going to do about it. Because Coraline had made one critical mistake in her perfectly executed theft. She'd forgotten that I knew her better than anyone else in the world. And more importantly, she'd forgotten that I was very, very good at research. The relationship between Coraline and me hadn't always been toxic. Growing up in Westridge Commons, we'd been inseparable. She was the artistic one, always painting or writing poetry, while I was the practical sister who helped with math homework and fixed broken things around the house. Our parents, David and Margaret Hayes, ran a small accounting firm and taught us both the importance of financial responsibility. At least, that's what they thought they taught us. Coraline learned different lessons. She learned that money problems could be solved by being charming enough, pretty enough, or desperate enough to convince someone else to pay. She learned that consequences were optional, if you knew how to make people feel guilty for holding you accountable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I learned that the only security in life was what you built yourself. The pattern started in high school. Coraline would borrow money from my part-time job earnings for concert tickets or new clothes, promising to pay me back from her babysitting money. She never did. When I'd bring it up, she'd cry about how stressed she was, how I didn't understand the pressure she was under, how family was supposed to support each other without keeping score. Mom and Dad always sided with her. She's your little sister, Amelia. She looks up to you. Can't you just be generous? So I stopped asking for my money back. I started hiding my earnings, and I learned to document everything. By college, the dynamic was fully established. I worked my way through nursing school with a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and careful budgeting. Coraline bounced between 3 different art schools, changing majors every semester and accumulating debt she had no plan to repay. When she couldn't make rent, I'd get tearful phone calls about how she just needed help. This one time until she got back on her feet. I helped her 6 times in 4 years. Each time she swore it was the last time. Each time our parents praised my generosity and her creativity. After graduation, I got hired at North Point Medical Center as a cardiac technician. The work was demanding but rewarding, and the pay was enough to start building real financial security. I moved into a small studio apartment in Millbrook Heights, drove my reliable Honda, and put every extra dollar into 2 accounts: retirement and emergency medical fund. The medical fund was born from practicality and fear. Working in cardiac care meant seeing how quickly lives could change. One day you're healthy and independent. The next you're facing procedures that cost more than most people's houses. Insurance was unreliable, coverage was limited, and medical bankruptcy was more common than anyone wanted to admit. So I saved. 60% of my income went to living expenses, 20% to retirement, 20% to the medical fund. I worked overtime whenever possible. I took on extra shifts during holidays. I lived like a monk, so that I'd never be at the mercy of medical bills. Coraline lived like a princess. She'd moved to Grandview Heights after college, into a 1-bedroom apartment she couldn't afford. She worked sporadically as a freelance graphic designer, which seemed to mostly involve posting inspirational quotes on Instagram, and complaining about clients who didn't appreciate her artistic vision. Her rent was $2,800 a month. Her car payment was $450. Her credit card debt was approaching $30,000. But she always looked perfect. Perfect clothes, perfect makeup, perfect social media presence. She dated men who took her to expensive restaurants and bought her jewelry. She traveled constantly, somehow always finding money for weekend trips to wine country or beach resorts. I never questioned where the money came from. I told myself it wasn't my business, that she must have figured something out, that maybe she was better at the freelancing thing than I understood. I should have known better. The first real warning sign came 2 years ago. Coraline called me crying, saying she was about to be evicted. She needed $8,000 immediately, or she'd lose her apartment. She'd already borrowed against her credit cards, already asked our parents, already exhausted every other option. I know I haven't been the best sister about money stuff, she sobbed into the phone. But I'm desperate, Amelia. I'll pay you back as soon as I land this big client. I'm pitching to next week. Against my better judgment, I transferred the money. The big client never materialized, and Coraline never mentioned paying me back. When I brought it up a month later, she got defensive. I can't believe you're keeping track like some kind of loan shark. I thought we were family. The second warning sign came last year. Coraline had co-signed on a car loan for some guy she'd been dating for 3 months. When he disappeared, she was stuck with a $45,000 debt for a BMW she couldn't afford to keep or sell. This is different, she insisted when she called asking for help with the payments. This isn't about me being irresponsible. I got taken advantage of. You wouldn't let your sister lose her credit rating over some loser's con job, would you? I helped her refinance the loan, and took over half the monthly payments. She promised to handle the rest. 3 months later, The bank called me because the payments had stopped. Coraline had apparently decided the car was too painful to keep, because it reminded her of her ex-boyfriend, so she just stopped making payments, and assumed I'd cover them. When I confronted her, she turned it around on me. You make so much more money than I do. These payments are nothing to you, but they'd destroy my budget. Why are you being so selfish about this? Our parents supported her, as always. She's going through a tough time emotionally. Maybe you could just handle the car payments until she gets back on her feet. You're so good with money, and she's struggling. I realized then that our family had established a clear dynamic. I was the responsible one, which meant I was responsible for everyone else's problems. Coraline was the creative one, which meant she was exempt from consequences. But I still didn't expect her to steal from me. Even when she asked to be my emergency contact for medical decisions, I thought it made sense. We were sisters. She lived in the same city. Our parents were getting older, and lived 3 hours away in Sacramento. If something happened to me, she'd be the logical person to make decisions about my care. I'd specifically chosen her for medical decisions only. I never gave her access to my financial accounts, never made her a beneficiary on my savings accounts, never included her in my power of attorney for financial matters. I wasn't naive about her relationship with money, but I was naive about her relationship with boundaries. The night of my accident, I'd been driving home from North Point after covering a double shift in the cardiac ICU. We'd lost 2 patients that day, both from complications that might have been prevented with earlier intervention. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and looking forward to getting home to my tiny apartment and my quiet life. I never saw the other car coming. According to the police report, the drunk driver was going 63 miles per hour when he ran the red light at the intersection of Pine Street and Hillcrest Avenue. The impact sent my Honda spinning into a concrete barrier, where it rolled twice before coming to rest upside down. The paramedics later told me I was lucky to be alive. The seatbelt had saved me from being ejected, but the force of the impact had still caused massive internal trauma. By the time they got me to Mercy General, I was unconscious and bleeding internally. Coraline arrived at the hospital 2 hours after the accident. I was already in surgery by then, but she positioned herself as my primary support person. She talked to doctors, signed forms, made herself indispensable to my care team. She also presented herself to the financial office as someone with authority to make payment arrangements for my treatment. The hospital staff had no reason to doubt her. She was my emergency contact. She knew personal details about my life, my job, my insurance coverage. She spoke confidently about my financial situation and my desire to receive the best possible care regardless of cost. What they didn't know was that while she was authorizing expensive treatments on my behalf, she was also systematically emptying the account that was supposed to pay for them. The cruise she booked was a 2-week luxury package to the Western Caribbean. Bahamas, Jamaica, Cozumel, Grand Cayman. The premium suite she selected cost $18,000. The excursion package added another $8,400. Spa treatments, specialty dining, shore excursions, premium beverage packages, all charged to my emergency medical fund, while I lay unconscious in intensive care. She'd planned it perfectly. Book the cruise while I was incapacitated and couldn't object, leave town before I woke up, and discovered the theft, return after 2 weeks with a tan, and a story about how she needed the mental health break to cope with the stress of my accident. What she hadn't planned for was the size of my hospital bill, or how quickly the hospital would need payment arrangements. She'd assumed she could steal my money, and I'd find some other way to handle my medical expenses. Maybe insurance would cover more than expected. Maybe I'd qualify for charity care. Maybe the bills would just work themselves out somehow. She'd gambled with my future mobility and lost. As I lay in that hospital bed, reviewing the financial documents and medical records, I felt something cold and precise settling into my chest. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't just betrayal. This was attempted murder by negligence. She'd deliberately sabotaged my ability to receive life-changing medical care, while I was helpless to stop her. The old Amelia would have called our parents, would have tried to work things out through family meetings and tearful conversations about forgiveness and understanding. But the old Amelia had died in that car accident. The woman who remained was done being generous. The pain medication was wearing off when I made the discovery that changed everything. It was 3:14 a.m., and I couldn't sleep, despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of my body. The morphine drip had been reduced as my condition stabilized, which meant I was finally thinking clearly for the first time since the accident. I'd been staring at my phone for the past hour, scrolling through Coraline's Instagram posts with a sick fascination. She'd been posting regularly from the cruise ship, pictures of herself in designer swimwear, on white sand beaches, videos of 5-course dinners with champagne toasts, stories about snorkeling excursions and spa treatments, all tagged with locations like Paradise Found and Living My Best Life. Each post felt like a knife twist, but I couldn't stop looking. This was my medical fund, transformed into luxury vacation content, my future mobility converted into social media bragging rights. But it was the comments that caught my attention. Under a picture of her lounging by an infinity pool, someone named Lucian Theros had written, "Enjoying the early retirement package, I see. Smart investment strategy. Early retirement package. Investment strategy." I screenshot the comment and kept scrolling. More photos, more evidence of my stolen money being converted into experiences I'd never be able to afford now. But I started paying closer attention to the people commenting on her posts, looking for patterns, for clues about where this money trail might lead. That's when I found the real smoking gun. Buried in the comments of a post from 3 days ago was a conversation between Coraline and someone named Theron Varick. Their exchange was casual, the kind of banter between people who knew each other well. "Told you the sister fund would come through. Enjoy every dollar of it. Coraline, best investment advice you ever gave me. She'll never even know it was an option. Theron, that's what family emergency funds are for, right? Emergencies like needing a vacation." I read that exchange 17 times before the full implications sank in. This hadn't been impulsive theft. This had been planned. Coraline had discussed using my medical fund for her vacation with someone else. Someone who had encouraged her to steal from me. Someone who knew about my savings and had helped her rationalize taking it. But who was Theron Varick? I ran his name through social media searches, public records, anything I could access from my hospital bed. What I found made my blood pressure monitor start beeping an alarm. Theron Varick worked as a financial advisor at Meridian Wealth Management here in the city. His LinkedIn profile showed 15 years of experience in alternative investment strategies and creative financial solutions for cash flow challenges. His client testimonials were full of phrases like "helped me access funds I didn't know I had," and "found money in places I never thought to look." More importantly, his client list included my sister. I dug deeper into his professional background, using the research skills I'd developed in nursing school to track down every piece of publicly available information. What I found was a pattern that made me sick. Theron Varick specialized in helping people access funds that weren't technically theirs. Adult offspring who needed their parents' retirement money. Spouses who wanted to liquidate shared assets without their partner's knowledge. Siblings who had access to each other's accounts through family arrangements. His website was carefully worded to avoid outright fraud, but the services he offered walked right up to the line of legal. Family financial mediation. Emergency asset liquidation. Creative solutions for immediate cash flow needs. Reading between the lines, he was a professional who helped people steal from their families. I found client reviews on financial forums that spelled out his methods more clearly. He'd help people identify family members with accessible assets, coach them through the process of gaining access to those assets, and provide legal cover by framing the theft as emergency family support or temporary borrowing. One review, posted by someone with the username Desperate in Denver, laid out the entire playbook. Theron helped me understand that my brother's savings account could be accessed through the medical power of attorney I had for our mother. He showed me how to position it as a family emergency and how to make sure the paperwork looked legitimate. The whole process took less than 48 hours, and my brother never even knew I had access until after the fact. By then I was able to present it as an emergency situation, where I had no choice. Theron's documentation made it look completely above board. My hands were shaking as I read review after review describing similar scenarios. Adult offspring stealing from their parents' medical funds. Spouses emptying joint accounts. Siblings manipulating family emergency situations to access each other's money. And all of them had Theron Varick providing the roadmap. But the discovery that really destroyed me came when I found Coraline's consultation notes. Theron's website offered a free initial consultation for family financial assessment. I managed to social engineer my way into his client portal by using information I knew about Coraline's financial situation and the dates of her consultation. Her file was a masterclass in premeditated theft. The consultation had taken place 6 weeks before my accident.
6 weeks.
She'd been planning this long before I was ever in danger, which meant she'd been looking for an opportunity to steal my medical fund and was just waiting for the right moment. The notes detailed my financial situation with terrifying accuracy. My salary at North Point Medical Center, the exact balance of my emergency medical fund, my work schedule and living situation. Even my habit of working overtime shifts, which would make me more likely to be tired and vulnerable to accidents. But the most chilling part was Theron's strategic recommendation, typed up in neat bullet points. Client has access to sister's medical decisions through emergency contact authorization. Sister's medical fund contains $127,000, accessible during medical emergency. Recommend waiting for legitimate medical crisis to avoid suspicion emergency situation. Provides cover for asset liquidation. Client should establish pattern of handling sister's affairs during recovery period. Suggest overseas travel immediately after fund access to avoid immediate confrontation. Reading those notes felt like discovering someone had been planning my murder. They'd been waiting for me to have a medical emergency so they could steal the money I'd saved to handle exactly that situation. Theron's fee structure was outlined at the bottom of the file. He took 15% of any successfully liquidated assets, plus a $5,000 consultation fee for complex family financial situations. 15% of $127,000 was $19,050. Plus his consultation fee. Coraline had paid him over $24,000 to help her steal my medical fund, but there was more. The file included a section called Risk Mitigation that detailed how to handle potential legal consequences. Theron had prepared Coraline for the possibility that I'd discover the theft and try to take legal action. His advice was to frame it as a misunderstanding, claim she'd intended to pay the money back, and position herself as the victim of a stressful family situation. He'd even provided her with a script. I was overwhelmed by the stress of Amelia's accident and made some poor financial decisions while trying to handle her medical affairs. I always intended to replace the money before she found out. I can't believe she's trying to criminalize what was obviously a family member trying to help during a crisis. The script included instructions on how to cry on cue and which family members to call for support in portraying herself as the victim. But the final section of the file was what pushed me over the edge into pure rage. Under a heading labeled Additional Revenue Opportunities, Theron had identified other assets in my life that Coraline could potentially access. My retirement accounts at work, my life insurance policy, my car title,
Even my apartment deposit.
He'd created a comprehensive plan for my sister to systematically steal everything I owned, using my medical emergency as cover for accessing accounts and my potential death as an excuse for urgent financial decisions. They'd turned my car accident into a business opportunity. I sat in that hospital bed reading through page after page of documentation that proved my sister hadn't just stolen from me impulsively. She'd hired a professional to help her plan and execute the theft. She'd waited for me to be vulnerable enough that I couldn't stop her, and she'd been prepared to steal even more if the opportunity arose. The medical fund was just the beginning. If I hadn't woken up when I did, if I'd been unconscious longer or suffered more severe brain trauma, she would have systematically emptied every account I'd ever worked to fill. For the first time since the accident, I wasn't thinking about my injuries or my medical bills or my uncertain future. I was thinking about revenge, but not the hot emotional kind that gets you arrested. The cold systematic kind that destroys someone's entire life while keeping your hands completely clean. Because Coraline and Theron had made one critical mistake in their perfectly planned theft. They'd documented everything. Dr. Beatrix Finch found me at 6:47 a.m., fully awake and typing furiously on my phone despite having surgery just 3 days earlier. She was making her morning rounds and had expected to find me sleeping off the pain medication, not conducting what appeared to be intensive research. "Miss Hayes, you should be resting," she said, checking my chart with the kind of professional concern that made her one of the best orthopedic surgeons at Mercy General. "Your body needs time to heal." "Dr. Finch, I need to ask you something about my medical power of attorney," I said directly. "What exactly can someone do with that authorization?" She raised an eyebrow and sat down in the visitor chair. Dr. Finch had been the one to perform my spinal surgery, the experimental procedure that might restore full mobility to my left leg. She'd also been the one to explain that without payment, I'd be transferred to County General for basic care only. Medical power of attorney allows someone to make healthcare decisions if you're incapacitated, she explained carefully. Treatment options, surgical procedures, care facility choices. But it doesn't include financial authority unless specifically stated. What if someone presented themselves to the hospital's billing department claiming to have financial authority they didn't actually possess? Dr. Finch's expression shifted from concern to something sharper. That would be fraud, both against the hospital and against you personally. She paused, studying my face. Miss Hayes, is there something specific you need to tell me about your situation? I showed her the Instagram posts, the bank records, the consultation notes from Theron Varick's file. I watched her expression change from professional concern to personal outrage as she absorbed the scope of what had been done to me. This is unconscionable, she said finally. Your sister stole your medical fund while you were fighting for your life, then left the country to spend it on a luxury vacation. It gets worse, I said, showing her Theron's strategic notes about waiting for my medical emergency and his plans for accessing my other assets. This wasn't impulsive, it was premeditated theft using my accident as cover. Dr. Finch was quiet for a long moment, reading through the evidence I'd compiled. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out her personal phone and started making a call. Camille, it's Beatrix. I need you to come to Mercy General as soon as possible. I have a patient who's been the victim of a sophisticated financial crime, and she needs the kind of help you specialize in. After she hung up, she turned back to me with a smile that was equal parts compassionate and fierce. Camille Sterling is my sister-in-law. She's a forensic accountant who works primarily with fraud cases involving healthcare systems. If anyone can help you unravel this situation and hold the people responsible accountable, it's her. Camille Sterling arrived 2 hours later carrying a leather briefcase and radiating the kind of controlled intensity that made me understand why Dr. Finch had called her. She was probably in her early 40s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the hospital room in seconds. Beatrix filled me in on the basics, she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. But I want to hear the entire story from you, including everything you've discovered about the people involved. I walked her through everything. The accident, waking up to discover my fund had been emptied, finding Coraline's Instagram posts from the cruise, uncovering her relationship with Theron Varick, and finally accessing his consultation notes that proved the theft had been planned weeks in advance. Camille took notes in a precise shorthand, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, amounts, and documentation. She showed no emotional reaction to the story, but I could see her professional interest sharpening with each new detail. This is actually more serious than simple theft, she said when I finished. What you've uncovered is evidence of a conspiracy to commit fraud against both you and the healthcare system. Karen Varick's business model appears to be built on helping people steal from family members during medical crises. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet, pulling up what looked like a case management system. I've worked on several cases involving financial crimes in medical settings. What makes this particularly egregious is the timing and the systematic nature of the theft. They didn't just steal your money, they sabotaged your medical care during a life-threatening emergency. What can actually be done about it? I asked. They're obviously not going to voluntarily return the money. Camille smiled, and for the first time since the accident I felt something like hope. Amelia, what you've stumbled onto here goes far beyond your individual case. Karen Varick's consultation notes suggest he's been running this scheme with multiple clients, using family medical emergencies as cover for systematic theft. That makes this a pattern of racketeering, not just individual fraud. She turned the tablet toward me, showing a flowchart that outlined the legal framework for the kind of case she was describing. We're going to build a federal case against Varick's operation, while simultaneously pursuing civil recovery for your stolen funds. But more than that, we're going to make sure your sister faces consequences that will follow her for the rest of her life. The strategy Camille outlined was methodical and devastating. First, we'd document everything. Every transaction, every communication, every piece of evidence that proved the theft was premeditated. She had forensic software that could recover deleted communications and trace financial transactions across multiple accounts. Second, we'd identify other victims. Karen's business model suggested he'd done this before, and finding other families he'd helped steal from would establish the pattern of racketeering needed for federal charges. Third, we'd coordinate with law enforcement. Camille had relationships with FBI agents who specialized in healthcare fraud and could ensure the criminal case proceeded parallel to our civil recovery efforts. The beautiful thing about criminals who document everything, she explained, is that they provide their own evidence. Karen's consultation notes don't just prove he helped your sister steal from you, they prove he's been systematically helping people commit fraud against family members during medical emergencies. But the part of the strategy that made me smile for the first time in days was what she called asset recovery and protection. Your sister is currently spending your stolen money on a luxury cruise, which means she's converting liquid assets into experiences that can't be recovered. But Karen took a significant fee for helping her, and I guarantee you he hasn't reported that income properly. We're going to freeze his assets first, then work backwards to your sister. Camille pulled up another screen showing a timeline of actions. Week 1, we file a preliminary asset freeze against both Theron and your sister, preventing them from moving any more money. Week 2, we coordinate with law enforcement to begin the criminal investigation. Week 3, we start identifying and contacting other victims to build the racketeering case. What about my medical bills? I asked. Even if we recover everything, that doesn't help me pay for treatment I need right now. That's where this gets interesting. Camille said, Mercy General has been defrauded just as much as you have. Your sister presented herself as having financial authority she didn't possess and committed fraud against the hospital's billing system. They have grounds to sue both her and Theron for the full amount of your medical expenses. She showed me a legal precedent where a hospital had successfully recovered medical costs from family members who had committed billing fraud. More importantly, once we establish that you're the victim of a crime that directly prevented you from paying for your medical care, the hospital has both legal and public relations incentives to work with you on payment arrangements. No hospital wants the negative publicity of refusing care to a crime victim. But Camille wasn't done. The final piece of her strategy was what she called comprehensive consequences. Your sister and Theron don't just need to face legal consequences. They need to face the kind of professional and personal consequences that ensure they never do this to anyone else. She outlined a plan that went beyond criminal charges and financial recovery. Professional licensing board complaints that would end Theron's career. Credit reporting actions that would destroy both of their credit ratings. Civil judgments that would follow them for decades. By the time we're done, your sister won't be able to get a credit card or rent an apartment without someone knowing she's a convicted thief who steals from family members during medical emergencies. As Camille packed up her briefcase, she handed me a business card and a small device that looked like a smartphone. This is a secure communication device. Everything we discuss going forward needs to be protected by attorney-client privilege. Don't use your regular phone or email for anything related to this case. She paused at the door and turned back to me with an expression that was both professional and personal. Amelia, I want you to understand something. What was done to you was evil. Not just illegal, but morally evil. They targeted you at the most vulnerable moment of your life and tried to profit from your suffering. But here's what they didn't understand. When you systematically document a crime the way they did, you create evidence that can destroy not just the individual criminals, but their entire network. We're not just going to recover your money and get them arrested. We're going to burn down their entire operation and make sure everyone knows what they did. As she left, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the accident. Power. For the first time in 4 days, I wasn't a victim lying helplessly in a hospital bed. I was a woman with a plan. The secure phone Camille had given me buzzed at exactly 7 a.m. with my first assignment. I'd been awake for hours anyway, no longer needing the heavy pain medication that had kept me unconscious for the first few days after surgery. My mind was finally clear, focused and hungry for action. Phase 1 begins today, Camille's encrypted message read. We start with documentation and evidence preservation. I need you to do exactly what I outlined below, in order without deviating from the script. What followed were detailed instructions that felt like a military operation disguised as routine administrative tasks. First, I needed to request complete copies of my medical records from Mercy General. Not just the basic summary, but every piece of paper, every communication, every authorization form that had been signed on my behalf while I was unconscious. The request had to be made in writing, using specific language that Camille had provided. Legal terminology that would ensure I received not just my medical information, but all communications related to financial arrangements, billing authorizations, and family contact documentation. We need proof that your sister exceeded her authority, Camille explained when I called her using the secure phone. Medical power of attorney doesn't include financial decision-making, but she presented herself to the billing department as having broader authority than she possessed. That's fraud in writing. While I waited for the medical records, my second assignment was to begin documenting every aspect of Coraline's current vacation. Not just the Instagram posts I'd already screenshot, but a comprehensive digital forensics project that would establish exactly how my stolen money was being spent. Camille had provided me with software that could track social media posts, capture metadata from uploaded images, and even identify locations and timestamps from seemingly casual vacation photos. The goal was to create a minute-by-minute accounting of where my medical fund had gone. Judges love this kind of evidence, she explained. We're going to show that while you were fighting for your life, your sister was posting pictures of $500 dinners and spa treatments that cost more than most people's rent. The work was methodical and emotionally brutal. Every image I processed was another knife twist, another reminder of what had been stolen from me. Photos of Coraline lounging on private beaches that cost $1,200 per day to access. Videos of her swimming with dolphins in excursions that cost $800 per person. Pictures of jewelry and clothing she'd bought in duty-free shops, using money I'd saved for potential life-saving medical treatment. But the metadata told an even more damaging story. The timestamps on her photos proved she'd been posting vacation content within hours of accessing my medical fund. She'd literally been celebrating her theft in real time while I lay unconscious in the ICU. By noon I had compiled a 47-page digital evidence portfolio, showing exactly how $127,000 of stolen medical funds had been converted into luxury vacation experiences. Every meal, every excursion, every purchase, documented with timestamps, locations, and costs. The medical records arrived that afternoon, delivered by a hospital administrator, who seemed uncomfortable with the thickness of the file she was handing me. This is everything you requested, she said carefully. All communications, authorizations, and billing arrangements related to your care. What I found in those records was even worse than I'd expected. Coraline hadn't just presented herself as having financial authority. She'd actually forged my signature on several documents, including a financial power of attorney form that she'd apparently created and signed herself while I was unconscious. The forged document was amateur-level fraud. My signature looked like it had been copied from something else, probably my driver's license or insurance card. The notarization was fake, using the name of a notary public who, according to public records, had been dead for 3 years. But the hospital billing department had accepted it without question, probably because Coraline had been so convincing in her role as the concerned sister handling my affairs. More damaging was the communication log between Coraline and the financial office. She'd called them 6 times in 2 days, each conversation recorded in detailed notes that proved she'd been deliberately misleading them about her authority and my financial situation. In one call she'd told them I was financially conservative and preferred to pay cash for medical expenses, rather than work with payment plans. In another, she'd claimed I'd specifically instructed her to liquidate my emergency fund to cover any medical costs that arose. She'd even told them I was too proud to accept charity care, and would be devastated if I woke up to find my medical bills hadn't been handled properly. All lies, all documented, all signed confessions to fraud. But the discovery that made me actually laugh out loud was buried in the billing correspondence. The hospital had tried to process a $50,000 payment from my account for the experimental spinal surgery, just as Patricia Chen had told me. But the payment had been declined, because the account had insufficient funds. What I hadn't known was that the hospital had automatically tried to process the payment 3 more times over the next 24 hours, as their system was programmed to do with declined payments. Each attempt had been declined, and each decline had generated an automatic email notification. Those emails had been sent to the primary email address on my account, my personal email, which meant I had electronic proof that Coraline had received notification that my medical payments were being declined due to insufficient funds, even as she continued to authorize additional medical expenses on my behalf. She'd known her theft was preventing me from receiving medical care, and she'd continued lying to the hospital anyway. Armed with this evidence, I made my first strategic move. Rather than confronting Coraline directly, or demanding she return the money, I followed Camille's advice, and began building a legal foundation that would make recovery inevitable. I filed a police report for identity theft and fraud, providing copies of the forged power of attorney and the bank records showing the unauthorized wire transfer. The detective assigned to the case, Sergeant Daniel Wild, was a veteran investigator who specialized in financial crimes against vulnerable adults. This is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen, he told me when I presented the evidence. Forged documents, unauthorized access to financial accounts, fraud against a medical institution, all while the victim was incapacitated. Your sister's looking at multiple felony charges. But Sergeant Wild's real value was his experience with similar cases. The thing about family financial fraud, he explained, is that it's almost never a one-time thing. People who steal from family members during medical emergencies usually have a history of financial manipulation. We're going to look into your sister's entire financial history, and I bet we find other victims. He was right. Within 48 hours of opening the investigation, Sergeant Wild had identified 3 other instances where Coraline had used family emergencies to access other people's money. Our cousin Marcus's college fund after his father was hospitalized with a heart attack. Our grandmother's estate funds after her stroke. Even our parents' savings account during Dad's cancer treatment 2 years ago. In each case, she'd positioned herself as the family member handling financial affairs during the crisis, gained access to accounts through forged documents or emotional manipulation, and then transferred funds for personal use, while claiming the money was needed for medical or family expenses. Your sister is a serial thief, Sergeant Wild told me bluntly. She's been using family medical emergencies to fund her lifestyle for years. The only reason she hasn't been caught is that her victims were either too sick to notice or too trusting to investigate. But the most powerful move came when Camille initiated the asset freeze. Using the evidence I'd gathered, and the police report as supporting documentation, she'd filed for an emergency court order freezing both Coraline's assets and Theron Varick's business accounts, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. The court order was granted within 6 hours. While Coraline was still lounging on her luxury cruise ship, posting Instagram stories about unlimited champagne service, her bank accounts were being frozen, her credit cards were being canceled, and her apartment lease was being flagged for payment security review. Theron Varick's business was shut down even more dramatically. The asset freeze included his office accounts, his client trust funds, and his personal banking. But more importantly, it triggered automatic reporting to the financial licensing boards that regulated his profession. By the end of week 1, Theron had received notice that his financial advisor license was under review for fraudulent business practices, his malpractice insurance had been suspended, and the IRS had opened an audit of his business accounts. But my favorite part of the strategy was what Camille called reputation management. She'd prepared a detailed press release about the case, focusing on the broader pattern of fraud targeting vulnerable medical patients and their families. The release positioned me not as an individual victim seeking revenge, but as someone exposing a systematic criminal enterprise that threatened other families facing medical emergencies. The story was picked up by 3 local news outlets and 2 national financial fraud awareness organizations. Within 72 hours, medical emergency financial fraud was trending on social media, with my case used as the primary example. The news coverage included interviews with other victims, expert commentary on how families could protect themselves from similar scams, and warnings about financial advisors who specialized in creative family asset access. Theron Varick's business was destroyed not just by the legal action but by the public awareness that made it impossible for him to continue operating. As I lay in my hospital bed at the end of that first week, reviewing the progress reports Camille sent me each evening, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the satisfaction of systematic justice. Coraline was still on her cruise, still spending my money, still posting vacation photos. But her world was collapsing around her in ways she wouldn't even discover until she tried to come home. Her accounts were frozen, her credit was destroyed, her theft was now public record. Her co-conspirator was facing federal charges. And she had no idea any of it was happening. The old Amelia would have felt guilty about the scope of the consequences I was orchestrating. The old Amelia would have worried about family relationships and whether I was taking things too far. But the old Amelia hadn't been betrayed at the moment of her greatest vulnerability. The old Amelia hadn't discovered that her own sister had planned her financial destruction while she fought for her life. The woman in this hospital bed was someone different. Someone who understood that mercy toward people who showed no mercy was just another form of victimization. Coraline had gambled with my future and lost. Now she was going to learn the cost of that gamble, and we were just getting started. The first crack in Coraline's perfect vacation paradise came on day 8 of her cruise, delivered through a frantic phone call from her landlord at 2:30 in the morning ship time. I know the exact timing because Camille had arranged for all communications related to the case to be monitored and recorded as part of the ongoing criminal investigation. Miss Hayes, there's been some kind of mistake with your rent payment. The landlord's voice was strained through the ship's satellite connection. Your bank is saying the account is frozen pending a fraud investigation. I need you to call me immediately to resolve this situation. Coraline's response, captured in the recorded call, was exactly what Camille had predicted it would be: confusion, denial, and immediate panic. That's impossible, she told him. There must be some kind of error. I'll call my bank right now and get this straightened out. But when she called her bank, the automated system delivered a message that changed everything. This account has been frozen by court order pending resolution of criminal fraud charges. For information about this hold, please contact the Fraud Investigation Unit during business hours. Criminal fraud charges. According to the ship's communication logs, which Sergeant Wilde had subpoenaed as part of the investigation, Coraline spent the next 6 hours making increasingly frantic phone calls. To her bank, to her credit card companies, to our parents, even to me, though my phone was set to send all her calls directly to voicemail. Each call delivered the same devastating news. Every account was frozen. Every credit card was canceled. Every financial lifeline she'd ever taken for granted was suddenly gone. But the real panic set in when she tried to book an early flight home from the cruise's next port stop in Jamaica. Her credit cards were declined. Her bank accounts were inaccessible. She had less than $200 in cash, and the cruise still had 6 days remaining. That's when she called our parents in Sacramento, a conversation that Camille had prepared me for, but which was still satisfying to hear about secondhand. "Mom, something terrible has happened," she sobbed into the phone. "Someone has stolen my identity and frozen all my accounts. I'm stuck on this cruise ship with no way to get home, and Amelia isn't answering her phone." Our mother's response revealed just how much the family dynamic was about to shift. "Coraline, we received a very disturbing call from a detective yesterday. He said Amelia is pressing charges against you for stealing her medical fund while she was unconscious. Please tell me that's not true." The silence that followed, according to Mom's later account to Camille, lasted almost 30 seconds. "It's not what it sounds like," Coraline finally managed. "There's been a huge misunderstanding. I was trying to help her medical situation, and everything got confused because of the stress. I can explain everything once I get home." But our parents had already been contacted by Sergeant Wilde as part of the investigation. They'd been shown the forged power of attorney documents, the bank records, and the evidence of Coraline's previous thefts from family members during medical emergencies. "Honey," the detective showed us documentation going back 5 years. Dad's voice was steady but cold. "This isn't a misunderstanding, this is a pattern." The conversation ended with our parents refusing to wire money for Coraline's early return flight. For the first time in her adult life, she was completely on her own financially, trapped on a cruise ship she'd paid for with stolen money, with no way to escape the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, the legal machinery I'd set in motion was accelerating beyond what even Camille had initially projected. The FBI had taken over the investigation into Theron Varick's business after discovering that his family financial mediation services had generated over $2.3 million in fees over the past 3 years. The pattern was always the same: identify vulnerable families facing medical crises, coach family members through the process of accessing assets that weren't legally theirs, then collect substantial fees while the victims were too sick or traumatized to fight back. Agent Talira Norell, the federal investigator assigned to the case, had identified 17 other families who had been victimized by Theron's operation. Each case followed the same blueprint: medical emergency, family member with some form of access to accounts, systematic theft disguised as emergency family support. "Your sister's case was actually one of the smaller thefts," Agent Norell explained when she visited me at the hospital. "We've found cases where Theron helped adult offspring steal their parents' entire retirement accounts during extended hospital stays. But what made the federal case devastating wasn't just the scope of the theft, it was the sophisticated nature of the operation. Theron had developed relationships with hospital billing departments, nursing home administrators, and medical financial counselors who would refer families in crisis to his services. He'd created a network of professionals who helped identify potential victims and provided legitimacy to his fraud operation. The referral fees alone constituted a separate criminal enterprise. We're looking at charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and healthcare fraud, Agent Norrell outlined. Your sister isn't just facing charges for stealing your money. She's facing charges as part of a criminal organization that systematically targeted vulnerable medical patients. While Coraline remained trapped on her cruise ship, desperately trying to figure out how to get home, Theron's world was collapsing in spectacular fashion. His office had been raided, his computers seized, his client files confiscated. But more immediately damaging was the media attention the case had generated. The story had evolved from a simple theft case into a major investigation of fraud targeting medical patients. National news outlets were covering the story, financial fraud awareness organizations were using the case in their educational materials, and social media was buzzing with families sharing their own experiences of financial abuse during medical crises. Theron's face was now associated with a type of fraud that particularly outraged the public, stealing from sick people and their families. His professional licenses had been permanently revoked. His malpractice insurance had been canceled. His office lease had been terminated. Even his personal banking relationships had been severed as financial institutions distanced themselves from the criminal investigation. But the consequences that gave me the most satisfaction were the ones Camille called social destruction. The news coverage had identified Theron by name, photo, and professional background. His LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments from victims and their families. His personal social media accounts were overwhelmed with angry messages from people who had been targeted by similar schemes. More importantly, the publicity had made it impossible for him to continue operating in any capacity. No legitimate financial institution would work with him. No professional organization would accept him as a member. His career wasn't just over, it was obliterated. Meanwhile, my medical situation was improving dramatically, both physically and financially. Dr. Finch reported that my response to the experimental spinal procedure was exceeding all expectations. The surgery had successfully prevented permanent nerve damage, and my mobility was returning ahead of schedule. More importantly, Mercy General's legal department had reclassified my entire case once the fraud investigation became public. Rather than treating me as a patient with payment issues, they now viewed me as a crime victim whose medical care had been sabotaged by criminal activity. The hospital had agreed to defer all payments pending the resolution of the criminal case, with the understanding that recovered funds would be applied to my medical expenses first. They'd also provided me with a private room, upgraded care, and access to specialists that would normally be reserved for their highest-tier patients. Hospitals hate negative publicity, Camille explained. The last thing Mercy General wants is news stories about how they considered transferring a fraud victim to County General because criminals had stolen her medical fund. But the development that surprised me most was the response from my coworkers at North Point Medical Center. Word had spread through the cardiac unit about what had happened to me, and my colleagues had organized both financial support and professional advocacy. They'd established a fund to help with my medical expenses, written letters to Mercy General supporting my case, and even provided testimony to investigators about my character and work ethic. You're not just fighting this as an individual. My supervisor Coraline told me when she visited. The entire cardiac team is behind you. What was done to you could happen to any of us, and we're not going to let it stand. The support was overwhelming and completely unexpected. I'd spent so many years focused on individual financial security that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community that would rally around a member in crisis. By the end of week 2, the momentum of consequences had accelerated beyond anything I'd imagined when this started. Coraline was trapped on a cruise ship with no money and no way home, facing felony charges that would be waiting for her the moment she returned to U.S. soil. Theron's criminal enterprise had been completely dismantled, with federal agents actively hunting for him as he'd apparently fled the country. My medical bills were being resolved through institutional support rather than personal bankruptcy. And I was recovering both physically and financially faster than anyone had predicted. The woman who had woken up in this hospital bed 2 weeks ago, devastated by betrayal and facing financial ruin, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned the power of systematic justice and community support. Someone who was about to discover that the best revenge isn't just getting even, it's getting everything. The moment I'd been waiting for came at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after Coraline had boarded her luxury cruise using my stolen medical fund. I was sitting in the hospital's rehabilitation center, working with a physical therapist on regaining full mobility in my left leg, when Camille called with news that made me stop mid-exercise. "She's back," Camille said simply. "Coraline's flight landed at Oakland International 20 minutes ago. Sergeant Wild and Agent Norrell are waiting for her at baggage claim with an arrest warrant." I set down the resistance band I'd been using, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. For 3 weeks, I'd been building toward this moment, orchestrating consequences from my hospital bed while she'd been trapped on a cruise ship watching her world collapse through panicked phone calls and declined credit cards. Now the reckoning had arrived. "I want to be there when she's processed," I told Camille. "That's not advisable," she replied carefully. "You're still recovering from major surgery, and there's no medical necessity for you to witness her arrest." "There's no medical necessity," I agreed. "But there's personal necessity. She stole my medical fund while I was fighting for my life. I want to look her in the eyes when she faces the consequences." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a wheelchair in the lobby of the federal building in downtown Oakland, watching as my sister was led through the security checkpoint in handcuffs. The transformation was startling. The Coraline who had left for her cruise 3 weeks ago had been perfectly put together, dressed in designer clothes, radiating the confidence of someone who'd just executed what she thought was a perfect crime. The woman being processed for booking looked like she'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. Her cruise tan couldn't hide the stress lines around her eyes. Her designer luggage, paid for with my stolen money, looked absurd next to the federal marshals escorting her. Most tellingly, she kept looking around desperately, as if searching for someone who would rescue her from a situation she couldn't manipulate or charm her way out of. When she saw me sitting in that wheelchair, the look on her face was everything I'd hoped it would be. Shock. Horror. And for the first time in our relationship, genuine fear. She tried to say something, but Agent Norrell kept her moving toward the processing area. I followed at a distance, Camille pushing my wheelchair, until we reached the observation area where victims were allowed to witness the arraignment process. The federal prosecutor handling the case, a sharp woman named Janessa Coultrin, had prepared a presentation that laid out not just Coraline's individual theft, but her role in the larger criminal enterprise that had victimized 17 families across 3 states. "Your Honor, the defendant Coraline Hayes participated in a sophisticated fraud operation that specifically targeted vulnerable medical patients and their families," Prosecutor Coultrin began. While her sister lay unconscious in intensive care following a near-fatal car accident, Ms. Hayes forged legal documents to gain access to her sister's medical emergency fund, then transferred $127,000 to pay for a luxury Caribbean cruise. The prosecutor displayed evidence that I'd helped compile over the past 3 weeks. Bank records showing the timing of the theft. Instagram posts showing how the stolen money had been spent. The forged power of attorney documents. Darren Varick's consultation notes proving the theft had been planned weeks in advance. But the evidence that seemed to impact the judge most was the medical documentation showing how the theft had directly endangered my recovery. Ms. Hayes's actions didn't just constitute theft, Your Honor. They constituted deliberate sabotage of life-saving medical treatment. Her sister required experimental spinal surgery to prevent permanent disability. The stolen funds were specifically saved for exactly this type of medical emergency. By taking that money for personal recreation, Ms. Hayes knowingly jeopardized her sister's long-term mobility and quality of life. I watched Coraline's face as the prosecutor detailed the scope of consequences her actions had triggered. The federal investigation that had uncovered 17 other victim families. Darren Varick's criminal enterprise being dismantled. The pattern of financial fraud targeting medical patients that had now become a national story. Her public defender, a tired-looking man who'd clearly been assigned the case that morning, attempted to frame her actions as a family misunderstanding amplified by stress and poor judgment. Your Honor, my client deeply regrets the confusion that arose around her sister's medical financial arrangements. She acted impulsively during a highly emotional period and fully intended to restore the funds before any harm was done. But Prosecutor Coraline was ready with evidence that destroyed that narrative completely. Your Honor, the defendant's phone records show that she received automated notifications when her sister's medical payments were being declined due to insufficient funds. She knew her theft was preventing life-saving medical care, yet she continued to authorize additional medical expenses while the account she'd emptied remained inaccessible. The prosecutor pulled up hotel and cruise line records, showing exactly how my stolen medical fund had been spent. While her sister was struggling to arrange payment for experimental spinal surgery, Miss Hayes was posting social media content about $500 dinners and spa treatments that cost more than most families' monthly housing budgets. This wasn't impulsive behavior driven by stress. This was calculated exploitation of a medical emergency for personal financial gain. When the judge asked Coraline if she wished to make a statement before bail determination, she finally looked directly at me for the first time since her arrest. "Amelia, I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice breaking in the way it always did when she wanted to manipulate someone's emotions. "I was going to pay you back before you even knew the money was gone. The cruise was non-refundable, and I thought you'd understand that I needed the mental health break to be able to support you through your recovery." Mental health break. Support me through my recovery. Even facing federal charges, even sitting in handcuffs in a federal courtroom, she was still trying to reframe her theft as somehow being for my benefit. I stood up slowly from my wheelchair, something I'd only been able to do for the past week as my mobility returned. The courtroom went quiet as I addressed her directly for the first time since discovering her betrayal. "Coraline, you stole my medical fund while I was unconscious and fighting for my life. You forged legal documents to access money I'd saved for exactly the emergency I was facing. You spent that money on luxury vacations while I was told I might never walk normally again without treatment I couldn't afford." My voice was steady, clear, and carried no trace of the emotional manipulation that had always characterized our family's communication patterns.
"You didn't make a mistake. You didn't act impulsively. You planned this theft weeks in advance with professional help, then executed it at the moment when I was most vulnerable and least able to defend myself." I turned to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, my sister has spent her entire adult life using family emergencies as opportunities to steal from relatives who trusted her. This isn't her first theft, and it won't be her last unless she faces consequences that finally match her actions." The judge's bail decision reflected the seriousness of the charges and the flight risk assessment. "Miss Hayes, you are charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, forging legal documents, and racketeering as part of a criminal enterprise. The evidence suggests premeditation, sophistication, and a pattern of similar behavior targeting vulnerable family members during medical crises. Bail is set at $500,000, with surrender of passport and GPS monitoring. Given the defendant's recent international travel funded by the alleged theft, and the risk that criminal proceeds may be hidden in offshore accounts, this court considers you a significant flight risk. $500,000 bail. For someone whose accounts were frozen, and whose criminal proceeds were tied up in federal asset forfeiture, it might as well have been $5 million. As the marshals led her away to begin processing for detention, Coraline looked back at me one final time. The desperation in her eyes was absolute. For 29 years, she'd been the sister who could charm, manipulate, or cry her way out of any consequences. The sister who could always find someone else to pay her bills, cover her mistakes, or clean up her messes. Now she was alone in a federal detention facility, facing charges that could result in decades in prison, with no money, no allies, and no way to manipulate the justice system that was finally holding her accountable. The role reversal was complete. 3 weeks ago, I'd been the helpless victim lying in a hospital bed, financially devastated and dependent on others for my care. She'd been the one with power, access to my accounts, and the ability to make decisions that affected my entire future. Now I was walking out of that courthouse on my own 2 feet, financially secure, supported by a community that had rallied around me, and backed by a legal team that had systematically dismantled everyone who had tried to exploit my vulnerability. And she was the one who was powerless, isolated, and facing a future entirely outside her control. As Camille wheeled my chair toward the courthouse exit, she handed me a folder containing the final piece of our strategic plan. "Asset recovery," she said simply. "The federal seizure includes not just the cruise costs, but all proceeds from Theron's criminal enterprise.
Your portion of the recovered funds will be substantially more than what was originally stolen. I opened the folder and saw numbers that made me understand the true scope of the justice we'd orchestrated. Not only would I recover every dollar of my medical fund, but the criminal forfeiture would result in compensation that reflected years of systematic fraud. But the money wasn't what made me smile as we left that courthouse. What made me smile was knowing that Coraline would spend the next several years in federal prison, with plenty of time to think about the cost of stealing from someone who trusted her with their life. The sister who had tried to profit from my medical emergency was about to discover what real consequences looked like. And I was just getting started with my new life. 18 months later, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at the Northern California Healthcare Financial Security Conference, looking out at an audience of medical professionals, social workers, and family advocates who had gathered to learn about protecting vulnerable patients from financial exploitation. The woman addressing that crowd bore little resemblance to the person who had once lain helpless in a hospital bed, financially devastated by family betrayal. My left leg had healed completely, with no trace of the injuries that had once threatened permanent disability. More importantly, the experience had transformed me into someone with a mission that extended far beyond personal recovery. Medical emergencies create perfect conditions for financial predators, I told the audience, clicking to a slide that showed statistics from the federal investigation that had grown out of my case. Patients are incapacitated, families are stressed, and large sums of money need to move quickly with minimal oversight. These conditions make medical fraud one of the fastest growing crimes in America. The presentation I was delivering had evolved from 18 months of work as a consultant with the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division. After my physical recovery, Agent Norell had recruited me to help identify and investigate similar schemes targeting medical patients and their families. My role was unique in law enforcement. I was both a victim who understood the psychological manipulation involved in family financial fraud, and a medical professional who understood how healthcare systems could be exploited by criminals, posing as concerned family members. The work was deeply satisfying in ways I'd never expected. Every case we solved, every criminal we convicted, every family we protected, felt like an extension of the justice I'd fought for in my own situation. The case that brought national attention to this issue involved my own family, I continued, advancing to a slide that showed the final outcomes of the investigation that had started in my hospital bed. But what began as individual theft expanded into a federal racketeering case that identified 23 victim families and recovered over $3.2 million in stolen assets. The numbers still amazed me, even after seeing them hundreds of times in reports and court documents. What had started as my sister stealing my $127,000 medical fund had uncovered a criminal enterprise that had been systematically exploiting medical emergencies for years. Theron Varick had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which he was prohibited from providing any form of financial advice or services. His criminal enterprise had been completely dismantled, with recovered assets distributed among the victim families he'd helped exploit. The sentence had been enhanced because of what the judge called exceptional cruelty, specifically targeting people during their most vulnerable medical moments. Theron would serve his full sentence with no possibility of early parole. Coraline's fate had been more complex, but ultimately more devastating. She'd been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, identity theft, and racketeering. But the criminal conviction was only the beginning of her consequences. The civil judgments from the victim families had exceeded $800,000, creating a debt that would follow her for the rest of her life. More personally destructive was the complete collapse of her social and family relationships. Our parents had not visited her in prison, or provided any financial support for her legal defense. The friends who had once enabled her lifestyle had distanced themselves once her pattern of financial manipulation became public. She'd written me several letters from prison, each one following the same pattern of self-pity, blame-shifting, and requests for financial help that had characterized her entire adult life. I'd read them all, then filed them with my lawyer without responding. The woman who had once been able to manipulate anyone into funding her lifestyle was now entirely alone, facing years of federal incarceration, followed by decades of financial consequences. The most important lesson from this case, I told the conference audience, is that family financial fraud often looks like family loyalty. The criminals present themselves as people trying to help during a crisis, which makes medical professionals and financial institutions less likely to scrutinize their claims. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a checklist I'd developed for healthcare providers to identify potential financial exploitation. Usual urgency around financial decisions, family members claiming authority they can't properly document, and requests to liquidate large amounts of assets during medical emergencies should all trigger additional verification procedures. After the presentation, I was approached by Dr. Cedric Vance, the conference organizer, who had become both a professional colleague and personal friend during my transition from cardiac technician to fraud prevention consultant. Every time you give this presentation, I'm amazed by how you've transformed this experience into something that protects other families, he said as we walked toward the reception area. It wasn't really a choice, I replied honestly. Once I understood how systematic this type of exploitation was, staying silent would have made me complicit in future victims' suffering. The truth was more complex than that, though. The transformation from victim to advocate hadn't been entirely altruistic. There was something deeply satisfying about using my expertise to identify and prosecute people who targeted vulnerable medical patients. Every criminal I helped convict felt like another piece of justice for what had been done to me. But beyond the professional satisfaction, the work had given me something I'd never experienced before, a sense of purpose that transcended individual financial security. My new position with the Healthcare Fraud Division paid well, but more importantly, it connected me to a community of professionals who were fighting to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. The isolation that had characterized my old life, working double shifts and saving money in preparation for disasters, had been replaced by meaningful work that prevented disasters for other families. The conference reception gave me a chance to connect with other professionals who were implementing fraud prevention programs in their institutions. These conversations were the most rewarding part of my work, hearing about families who had been protected because healthcare providers now knew what warning signs to look for. We identified 3 potential fraud cases last month, using your assessment protocols, a hospital social worker from Sacramento told me. All 3 involved family members trying to access patients' financial accounts during medical emergencies, using documentation that didn't quite match their claimed authority. Stories like that made every difficult moment of the past 18 months worthwhile. As the evening wound down, I drove home through the hills above Millbrook Heights to my new apartment, a spacious 2-bedroom place with large windows and room for the home office I'd needed for my consulting work. The Honda I'd been driving during my accident had been replaced with a reliable Subaru, purchased with recovered asset funds that had exceeded my original medical fund by nearly 40%. But the most significant change wasn't financial or professional, it was personal. The woman who had once lived in fearful preparation for potential medical disasters, saving money desperately against an uncertain future, had been replaced by someone who understood that real security came from community, purpose, and the power to fight back against exploitation. I'd learned that the best defense against betrayal wasn't perfect financial planning, though that remained important. The best defense was building relationships with people who shared your values and would stand with you when others tried to tear you down. My co-workers at the Healthcare Fraud Division, the medical professionals I trained through conference presentations, even the other victims I'd connected with through the federal investigation, had become a support network that would have been impossible in my old life, of isolation and individual financial preparation. As I settled into my home office that evening to review case files for the next day's investigations, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The medical emergency that had once threatened to destroy my financial security and physical mobility had become the foundation for work that was more meaningful than anything I'd ever imagined. Coraline had stolen my medical fund, believing she was taking my future. Instead, she'd forced me to build a future that was larger, more impactful, and more secure than anything I could have achieved through individual savings alone. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempt to exploit my vulnerability had transformed me into someone dedicated to protecting others from exactly the kind of exploitation she represented. She'd gambled with my future and lost everything. I'd survived her betrayal and gained a life of purpose that extended far beyond anything she'd tried to steal from me. And in federal prison, with 7 more years of her sentence remaining, she had plenty of time to contemplate the true cost of that gamble. Meanwhile, I had work to do, families to protect, and a mission that gave my life meaning she would never understand. The woman who had tried to profit from my medical emergency was gone, replaced by someone who fought to ensure that no family would ever face what I'd endured. And that transformation, more than any financial recovery or criminal conviction, was the most complete justice of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.